The War of 1812 ranks high as one of America's lesser-known wars, though not quite joining the likes of the Forgotten Wars. One still often thinks of the Revolution or the Civil War when asked about major American conflicts. The War of 1812 happened somewhere in between and played an important role in legitimizing American independence, as well as its place as the new dominant power of the Americas, essentially the first colonial child of Europe to really come into its own and abandon the secure guidance of its parent countries. Even today, you might say that the other American nations had either broken away too late or too early, and that this contributed to continued American strength even to this day. The circumstances of the 1812 war were based on two primary motives. Firstly, as stated before, the United States had sought to further assert its independence from Britain, who at the time, being engaged in the Napoleonic Wars, was seeking to draft soldiers wherever it could, and that meant drawing upon former British citizens in the US through the capture and recruitment of American sailors at sea. It is important to note that Britain justifies this based upon the fact several of their own citizens had attempted to flee conscription by escaping to the US. However, several Americans were no doubt rounded up in the mix either by mistake or disregard for American legitimacy. Further, Britain had earlier ceded what was known as the Northwest Territory to the US, a region comprising Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The British, however, held little intention of allowing the US to fully claim this land, and in fact aimed to establish a native Confederation buffer state to secure its Canadian settlements along the Great Lakes from American expansion. This entailed the arming of natives and encouragement of them to raid incoming American settlements, which in turn resulted in a terrible loss of civilian life that the American Congress deemed unacceptable. For some in Britain, including large portions of the elite, the American Revolution was a temporary inconvenience which would not last, and ultimately the states would rejoin the empire by one way or another. Americans were aware of this sentiment and knew that so long as their nation was perceived in this way, it would continue to be battered and undermined by the European powers, which it simply couldn't afford. This would go on to form the basis of the Monroe Doctrine as a warning to European imperialists that the US would stand up and fight for its own domain, even if grossly outmatched. Now, the secondary motive was the war hawk and expansionist camp, who saw British presence in Canada as a lingering vestige of what had been fought against in the States, asserting that the Revolution was not yet over until all traces of British power were driven from the continuous continent, and reconquest of the US by Britain made entirely impossible. There was a sense, too, that the Canadians were enduring much the same oppressive strife which had been seen in the colonies, and that it was an American duty to liberate their brothers from this tyrannical force. The Canadians, however, were in large part comprised of loyalists, several of which had actually fled the US years prior, and maintained a tremendous respect for the British Crown, which left them feeling little different from their precursors overseas. Despite this difference of opinion, an invasion of Canada was pushed forward under the assumption that British forces would be too preoccupied with Napoleon to intervene. However, America itself had overestimated its own chances, believing its militias alone held the capability to bring about peace negotiations, but several New England militias refused to participate, and William Hull's defeat at Fort Detroit following the failed invasion of Ontario demonstrated that Canadians were not willing to negotiate so quickly. Ultimately, the war came to an end without a very clear winner. Canada saw a wave of national pride in response to having so successfully repelled the American invasion largely on their own. The Americans were proud to have asserted to Britain that they were not to be trifled with, and Britain was simply satisfied to have not lost any major territories in the conflict. But what if things had gone differently? What if in an alternate timeline the US had successfully ousted Britain from the north and incorporated its Canadian lands into the United States? How this could have been accomplished could go several ways, from the Canadians simply being more cooperative to American forces having a greater military advantage. Drawing from both possibilities will suggest conditions were simply more as had been previously expected, with New England's militias at the ready and the Canadians less resistant perhaps on account of talks with the more pro-British Federalists, or perhaps even through American collaboration with the French Canadians of Quebec. Once again, we'll be using a little bit of both options. And so Canada is brought under American occupation, and Britain has its hands too full with Napoleon to attempt an intervention. A large number of loyalists flee the continent, leaving those who remain to be generally pro-British but supportive of the American order, granting greater numbers to the ranks of the Federalists, who, though still dwindling, would see a rebound thanks to Canadian incorporation and its own cooperation in the war, which, lack thereof in our own timeline, had cost them much popularity. Canada's measly population of 77,000 at the time would, however, be but a drop in the water for the US's population of 7 million, meaning the Federalist Party would still be unlikely to sire a champion even in this alternate world, unless by some chance the opposition was split, leaving the Federalist plurality of 39% a very likely winner. That said, northern, or rather greater New England politics would see overall domination by Federalist policy in the years to follow. French Quebec remains a prime exception to Federalist rule and would be granted status as a state along with Upper Canada, known now as Ontario, both joining rank with the new states of Labrador and Nova Scotia, whilst Rupert's Land and other low population areas were incorporated as a territory along with the recently acquired Louisiana. leaving Britain only a number of holdings in the Caribbean and contested claims to the region of New Albion, which would eventually be claimed by the US as the Oregon Territory. The era of good feelings which follows would see an adoption by the incumbent Democratic Republicans of more federalist centralization in economics, just as in our own world, having recognized the potential good that could have been achieved through government-directed development of the nation in places of infrastructure and of production. Monroe had even attempted to merge the Federalists with his own party to gradually eliminate all party associations, which he claimed were, by their very nature, incompatible with free government. Ideally, the business of governing was best conducted by disinterested statesmen, acting exclusively in the national interest, not on behalf of sectional politics or personal ambition. This policy of amalgamation had worked so well that he virtually ran unopposed in 1820. However, the method in which he went about merging the two parties was by essentially starving out the Federalists and assimilating their members through similar policy and more alluring power. In this world, that's not as easy. Monroe would likely be made to sit down and compromise with the Federalists instead of attempting to disregard their party entirely as he had in our world, needing to make more appeasements of the Federalists, which would ultimately prove disastrous, even more so than what had been seen in our own world, as by foregoing party unity and dedication to strict party values, Monroe had both seen wide division on policy unmendable where party unity once closed the gap, and further witnessed the Democratic-Republican schism with John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson pulling it in opposing directions. In adopting the centralization and pro-business ideals of the Federalists, Monroe was seen as a traitor to the ideals of Jeffersonian democracy, which stressed limitation of the central government and the importance of defending agrarianism over industrialism. And as the election of 1824 came about in this timeline, so did the Democratic-Republicans split into the Democrats headed by Andrew Jackson and the Republicans led by Henry Clay, with only Crawford maintaining the title of the original party. Adams in this world would rejoin the revived Federalists and campaign under them. Clay campaigned on a platform of protective tariffs, infrastructure development, and strong federal government. Jackson campaigned on a policy of greater executive power, stronger state governments, and manifest destiny. Crawford maintained strict state sovereignty and adherence to limitation of federal power, and Adams maintained much of the Federalist agenda with the exception of British preference, having in our own world initially broken with the party over his favoring of an embargo on British goods. The race would come close between Jackson and Adams, Jackson winning a plurality of electoral votes, while Adams ultimately won the presidency through a vote in the House of Representatives. Politics in the following years would become more polarized. Adams, with his greater support from Canadian territories, is able to push through plans for a national university and naval academy, as well as the construction of roads and railways to be funded in part through tax and through sale of lands in the north and west to pioneering settlers. Tariffs put forward by the administration as well as handling of the Native American population would drive a greater gap between the northern industrial states and the southern agrarian states, Adams seeking to better assimilate the less aggressive tribes in the north, while the South demanded total eviction of the aggressive southern tribes, which posed a constant threat to new settlements. Britain would end all trade between the US and its colonies in the West Indies, further estranging the Federalists from their policy of friendliness to Britain, now utilizing Adams' history as a minister to Russia to build friendly trade relations with the Russian Empire instead. Federalist ambition of maintaining an aristocracy of politicians and intellectuals would be shot down by the now more egalitarian support base that had carried over from the Monroe era, meaning the Federalists, though able to pass much of their economic legislation into law, were continually rebuffed in their efforts to implement their social and legal agenda of liberty through elite leadership. By the elections of 1828, the North-South divide would become clear as remnants of the Democratic-Republican and National Republican parties would be assimilated into the Democrat and Federalist parties. The political schism of the previous election had been key to thrusting the Federalists back into power. However, this time things are more clear-cut, and Jackson would carry overwhelming state support, even despite Federalist sympathy having branched out to the Great Lakes states. Jackson and his Democrats would set a precedent on American policy for at least the next decade, strengthening the role of the president while diverting federal power to the state governments and carving out several new states with the aim of further expansion westward. And so it would with the annexation of the Republic of Texas in 1845 and the subsequent Mexican-American War. Post-war, there'd be a great debate over how much land to claim from the defeated Mexico, Federalists proposing a liberal sum of northern land granting total access to the Pacific. The Democrats, however, felt they might as easily assert domain over all of Mexico. The issue with this was twofold. Firstly, an unsettling of the North-South balance of power, drastically in the Democrats' favor, as the South would essentially be assured more agricultural land and potential slave states. However, the Democrats would claim that with the acquisition of Canada, the Federalists would inevitably come to dominate the nation once settlement of the North was complete, and thus the South required its own room to expand and maintain the balance of power. A compromise would be made to allow, in addition to the southwestern territories, the annexation of the republics of the Rio Grande and Yucatan, as well as the territory of Baja California. Mexico would later see the loss of its southern and northernmost territories to independence movements, leaving it only its densely populated core. Although Democrat politicians would come to dominate American politics for a time, it would be their own policy of local autonomy and state sovereignty which would aid the Federalists in solidifying their grasp over the Northeast, having made of these states a near homogeneous Federalist bloc of predominantly English and minor German cultures, built on a lifestyle of industry and coastal living. Unity in the region would be so strong that an unofficial union would exist, having lifted most barriers between the individual states with the exception of Quebec. A case would even be put forward to Congress for one of two proposals of union, either a union of all the region states, save for Quebec, into a single massive entity, or multiple smaller unions to form the states of Greater New England, Hudson, and the Midlands. The movement was met with some opposition as a number of Democrats suggested it would suppress non-Federalist power in the area, while others supported the proposal on the grounds that it would ultimately reduce the number of Federalist representatives in the Senate. Whatever the outcome, this was part of a larger play by the Federalists to finally break away from the Democrats who they'd come to perceive as being too politically incompatible. And in 1867, following a Democrat collaboration with France to install a puppet government within Mexico and the purchase of Alaska and Greenland from Russia and Denmark, the Federal States of America would officially declare their secession from the Union, claiming domain over all unorganized territories north of the 42nd parallel. The Union of the South would attempt to seize back Federalist land but would find itself strained on logistics, resources, and manpower. An offensive war against the more densely populated and developed North was infeasible and beyond public favorability, and so following a brief resistance to the partition, an agreement of peaceful separation would be made and the two would move in their own directions. The Federal States would be seen as a very strategic ally to both Britain and Russia, both of whom would vie for the new nation's friendship. Britain appealing to the nation's English heritage, while Russia appealed to early relations and antagonization of Britain. The Southern Union and independent Quebec would form a firm alliance with the French Empire, both setting their attention to Latin America and specifically driving Britain from the Caribbean. The Banana Wars, a series of American interventions in Latin America following the acquisition of Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain, would serve as a perfect transition period to make of these occupied lands overt American colonies. The Federal States would occupy themselves in both internal projects and maintaining peace in the North Seas to ensure trade continues steadily. This would lead to noteworthy intervention in the Russo-Japanese War to ensure its trade ally maintain a strong footing in the area, while at the same time appeasing Japanese desires for claims to Korea in order to cut the conflict short and maintain Russian occupancy of Manchuria. This would in the long term dampen the disillusionment with the Russian Tsar, which had contributed to the Bolshevik Revolution, and at the same time doing well to blunt the Japanese nationalism which had followed in our timeline and contributed to the mass Japanese expansion during the Second Great War. French and Southern occupation of Mexico would leave them quarreling with remnants of what would have been the Mexican Revolution based on issues of representation, Europeanization, and social reform. These risings would be snuffed out by the two great powers and followed by more intense oversight in Central America, asserting that liberties must be earned through the demonstration of morality of a people, and that pure democracy in Central America will not be possible until the Central Americans learn to elect good men. It was a perception which had been adopted during the Banana Wars in our own timeline and represented a recognition of civilizing processes all societies need go through before democracy can even be considered without a major risk of corruption or failure. However, this would now be in the lap of the Democrat Union, which had historically been built on the ideals of self-sovereignty and upholding of freedoms between all men. It would be something which in this world would divide the Democrats into two major camps. On one side would be the liberal Democrats who'd stand on a platform of expanded suffrage, elimination of the representative system to be replaced with direct vote, and total abolition of slavery in the few states where it would still linger. The conservative Democrats, on the other hand, would maintain that the vote remain exclusively to white men at a minimum age of 21, representatives be maintained to prevent any state from becoming too powerful over the others, and states, including territories, be subject to their own jurisdiction over that of the central government. The liberal Democrats essentially aiming to further decentralize the states to put power in the hands of the absolute majority, while the conservatives sought to enforce local autonomy of the states and ensure voting power remain in the hands of those deemed most capable. This schism in the party would soon lead the conservative Democrats, while they still retain power, to begin rapprochement with the Federalists in a proposition for reunion, having seen the faults and vulnerabilities of its own system through years of practice and refinement. Likewise, the Federalists would have come to recognize the hazards of centralizing power so directly, having, with their majority English population, alienated the largely German populations of the Midlands, who, with tensions rising between Britain and Germany, came to identify more strongly with their ancestral roots and reject the near-exclusive English descendant leadership. Reunion came with a melding of the parties into one which delegated power back to the states, but maintained the high standards of leadership carried forward by the Federalists through an improved representative system and stronger electoral college. This United States, once the Great War came about, though has potential to remain entirely neutral or simply supply both sides, had it found a reason to involve itself, would likely align with the Entente just as in our own world. As stated before, without the sheer humiliation of an outright loss to Japan, Russia narrowly squeaks by without a revolution, the Tsar likely being coached by both Britain and the US to adopt more democratic policy, at risk of facing the same political turmoil Germany would have immediately seen following the conflict. Japan, though it still held ambitions of dominating Asia, would seek easier targets in the post-war era, likely Taiwan, Dutch Indonesia, and the Spanish Philippines. Additionally, being less willing to outright disobey the orders of the League of Nations, given the compromises the US helped it achieve. That is, of course, if the League of Nations even exists, which may be unlikely. As a side note, Liberia would also be thriving fairly well in this world, as southern states which abandoned slavery would have opted to send their freedmen there, thus never leaving the region with the underpopulation it had suffered from in our world. In the end, this union between Canada and the US would have tilted the balance in what would have been an early power struggle between the North and South, ideals of centralization and decentralization, industry and agriculture, of federal power and states' rights. With the balance of power tilted ever more evenly, and decentralization ultimately contributing to the unity of the more cohesive group, the two were able to go their separate ways more cleanly, and more importantly, were able to mend past divisions for the preservation of that which they both sought to secure. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. You can pick up a copy of our novel I Am Uncle Sam in the links below, support your Legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.